All right, guys, I wanted to go ahead and get on and show you a little bit about the graphing inverses assignment. It was assignment number 2 from week 1. You do have a quiz over it this week, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first, make sure you're checking your comments for any returned work. That doesn't mean you'll have a comment on each attachment that you uploaded, but make sure you are clicking the box with the arrow if you're on your phone to make sure you can see those private comments on your actual attachment if we left those, okay? So some common mistakes when you're graphing. Putting arrows on both ends of the square root, that is wrong. Remember, when you're graphing a square root function, it's half of a parabola, so it has a restricted domain. The second thing was make sure you're graphing the line y equals x, which will always be the line of reflection. The function and its inverse will be symmetrical to that line, so it'll help you check your answer. Third thing, restricting the domain. This was a big one. When you are restricting the domain, that's just telling your reader that you know that it's only a half of a parabola, okay? And then domain and range just all together, and then determining what numbers to use in the table. So let's go ahead. We're going to do this example. The first thing we need to do is go ahead and solve for the inverse. So I'm going to switch my x and y values. And then I'm going to solve for y. So I need to add 4 to both sides. The opposite of square rooting is to square. What you do to one side of the equation, you need to do to the other. These undo each other. They're inverse operations. So you're left with x plus 4 squared equals y plus 3. So you just need to subtract 3 from both sides. And you're left with y, which is what we want. So when we go to write the inverse, make sure you use the correct notation. Okay, so everything I do with the inverse will be in pink. Everything I do with the original function will be in green. So let's go ahead and create our table. And I think this is where a lot of you all got stuck, like you didn't know what numbers to use in the table. So let me give you a little hint. When you are talking about the square root type of problems, you want to think about what makes what's under the square root 0. So what plus 3 gives you 0? That would be -3. Okay, so -3 plus 3 is 0, and 0 minus 4 is -4. Now, let me show you a way to check that in your calculator. Go ahead and go to your y equals button. Okay, I already have this typed in for us. We just need to make sure we have it typed in correctly. It's good to go. So let's go ahead and go to the table, and then you can see that you've got -3, -4 right here, and it is in the table, so you did plug that in correctly. If you keep scrolling up, you're going to notice that all of the x values that are below -3 have an error message. That just means that you have a restricted domain. You have some x values that won't work. So while we have the table pulled up, let's just go ahead and grab some points off of here. I'm going to be smart and choose the whole number point, so I'm going to choose -2, -3. I'm also going to choose 1, -2. Then I'm going to scroll down and find one more point with whole numbers. So 6, -1. And then you're going to literally flip those two columns for your x and y on your inverse function. So you don't even need to type in the inverse function to the calculator unless you're checking your final answer, your final graph. So I've got -4, -3, -3, -2, -2, 1, and -1, 6. And so now we need to talk about domain and range. So domain is all of your x values, and the range is your y values. So remember, domain started at the point -3, -4 for the original function. If you remember, when we scrolled up in the table, we had errors for all of the other x's. That means that those x values aren't going to be in the domain. So any x value that is greater than or equal to -3 will be in the domain. Same thing for the y value. You're literally going to take this first y value we started with, and that's your range. So don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. Now, when you go and do your domain and range for the inverse, just like you switched your x and y values, your y columns here, you're going to switch your domain and your ranges. Okay, so here I'm going to have x is greater than -4, and then y is greater than or equal to -3. Remember, domain is still talking about x's, range is still talking about y values, so make sure you have those correct variables there. Now, this is the one where you have a restricted domain. So when you write out the inverse, you actually need to tell your audience or your reader that it's a restricted domain and x has to be greater than or equal to -4. And that's because this is a parabola, okay? So the inverse of this square root function is a U shape, but we only want to reflect it over y equals x and have half of that. So we need to actually state that. And now we just need the graph. So let's get a ruler out, make it pretty. Okay. Oh, come on. And now we have our XY plane. You need to first start with graphing that y equals x line of reflection. I did have a couple questions about y equals x. Remember, that is a line that goes through the origin. And now we can graph our inverses by plotting those points. So -3, -4, -2, -3, 1, -2, and 6, -1. And then we just need to do the inverse. We can see that it's probably going to be somewhere right here, but we want it to be accurate, so let's go ahead and plot those points. -3, -2, -2, 1, and -1, 6, 1, 2, 3. Yep, right there. And we can see, if you can visualize, okay, that wasn't a great curve, but it's okay. So if you were to fold your paper on, like, think of patty paper. If you were to fold your paper on this y equals x line right here, this would lay on top of this. If we didn't actually restrict the domain here, then we would have this U shape right here, and then that wouldn't be correct. Okay, so I did see a lot of you all had one square root function and then one that looked like this. That's because if you're typing this in, if you're typing this right here into your calculator, it's going to give you the entire U shape. You only want half of that, the reflection of that original square root function. Okay, the other thing is when you're doing start getting your table for a linear function or a quadratic. So for example, if I give you 5x minus 1, when you're starting your xy table here, if it's linear, I would always choose negative numbers, 0, and then some positives. Okay, that way you get a good shape of that line. And then if you're doing a quadratic, I would make sure I have my vertex there in my table. So this is when you're starting with a parabola. Okay, so you would want to make sure you have the full U shape, not just half of it. All right, guys, that's it. Let us know if you have more questions.